Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a leadership spotlight. We were trying to brainstorm things that came up last year with our clubs and organizations. And those two things were professionalism and also conflict management. I think there was a question actually earlier in the chat that related a little bit about conflict management. And I know it can sometimes be really difficult to deal with as student orgs. So those are the two things we wanted to talk about. So we really encourage you to be professional when you're working with our office, other departments, as well as each other. Like I mentioned before, our office has had to deal with many internal organizational conflicts recently. And while these students had requested our help for these internal conflicts, which we're happy to give, we also want to be able to equip you all with the tools to manage these conflicts independently. You can do the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about professionalism. And personally, when I used to hear this word, I'd kind of roll my eyes. Professionalism isn't really, or I didn't think it was my thing. And that's because I think the definition of professionalism can get kind of construed. I think that our definition might surprise you as everyone's is slightly different. Professionalism for student leaders, according to our definition, is showing consistent demonstration of responsibility, ethical behavior, effective communication, respect, and a commitment to continuous learning and personal growth. So what is it not? Being professional does not mean that you can't be yourself. It doesn't mean you can't express your emotions. It doesn't mean that you can't be vulnerable or be imperfect. It doesn't mean you can't mess up. I think I used to think that being professional meant I had to be this kind of corporate robot and I couldn't kind of have those traits unique to myself, but that's not the case at all. We just really want to make sure that you're demonstrating that responsibility and ethical behavior while still being able to be vulnerable. So to talk a little bit more about emotional professionalism, we're going to watch this quick video. It's only like 3 or 4 minutes long, I think. But hopefully it pulls up okay. I just thought it was really beneficial to learn about this new definition of professionalism.
Give me 1 second while I pull this up, and feel free to ask any questions you have about leadership while I do this.
If we're having issues too, Meredith, we can totally just send it out to them in the Teams. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry, my tab closed. All right, here we go. I will now play the video. Let me know if y'all can hear it.
Some people turn off the humanity when they go to work. They may be, loving parents and loving friends and loving, children to their own parents, and yet for some reason there's a switch that they think that that's irresponsible to do at work. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily wearing your heart on your sleeve every day. There is something called emotional professionalism. If you're having a bad day, you can say, listen, I'm a little off my game today, but you can't sit in a meeting with your arms folded and be grumpy and give one-word answers. That's emotionally unprofessional. You can have hard feelings, but you can't go around screaming and yelling at people. You can have, so I think there is emotional professionalism. But I think for some reason, especially as people make their way up the ranks, they think that expressing any kind of emotion is a sign of weakness. Even that word vulnerability, we talk, it's such a common word now being talked about in the business world that you have to be vulnerable. To this day, it makes some people feel very uncomfortable. I don't want to be vulnerable. Well, all vulnerability means is saying things like, I don't know, or I need help, or I'm overwhelmed, or can you help me do. And the reason we're afraid of saying that is for fear that it makes us look weak, which will then damage our careers. The reality is the total opposite. By saying I don't know means someone can help us. But instead we choose to lie, hide, and fake very often, which eventually gets revealed. Enough stress piled on that lying, hiding, and faking collapses either professionally or personally. We either feel the stress or the projects that we're working on start to go haywire. And very often when we get to those points, everybody knows anyway. The amazing thing that I've learned is when you say, can somebody somebody help me? We're surrounded by people who would love to help us. They just didn't think we needed it because we acted as if we didn't. So I think a large part of it is quite frankly fear. Fear that if I express these things, that people will think I'm not qualified for my job, where the opposite is true. And remember, when you are in a position of leadership, you don't actually have to be better at doing the job that the people you lead. You have to be responsible for taking care of them to make sure they're good at their job. But for some reason, we think that I have to be better than you at your own job because I'm the leader. Completely false. I just have to make sure that you're equipped, you have the tools, the training, and the psychological safety to be the best you can be, even if it's better than me.
Yay, thank you, Meredith, for pulling that up. So I know it might kind of seem like a little, at initial glance, maybe kind of basic information, but this topic of professionalism really does come up often. And I think a lot of times with all these things we view as barriers to getting our events set up, I know it seems like a lot, like this whole presentation, we're throwing a lot at you, and it kind of comes with having high emotions. So a lot of times we'll have students come in or go to other organizations such as unions and activities frustrated, and we totally get it, and we feel your frustration as well. But we need to be able to express that frustration while still having that emotional professionalism and being able to draw that boundary. So I hope that it was a little bit helpful. Like Michelle said, I really like him. I think that he provides a lot of good kind of modern professionalism and leadership suggestions. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Yeah, I'm glad you guys thought it was helpful. Meredith and I are both mental health counseling students, so I have the tendency to want to talk about and focus on things related to emotions and conflict and stuff like that. So if you're ever struggling or want help with some of those topics, you can come talk to us in the office. Speaking of, I don't know if you want to throw in the chat or if you want to just raise your hand on your screen, whatever you want to do. How many of you feel uncomfortable with conflict? Because I know I do. Okay, I feel like I'm getting a couple. Yeah, conflict, to be completely vulnerable with you guys, makes me so nervous. Or sorry, with you all, makes me really nervous. I tend to sweat whenever conflict arises. I had a position in an organization when I was in my undergrad, and dealing with the conflict in that organization was some of the toughest lessons I had to learn. But I also think it taught me some of the most beneficial lessons in my undergrad. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of messages. We all hate it, or a lot of us hate it, right? Okay, so to help kind of learn more about conflict, we can go to the next slide. And yeah, and some people don't mind it. Some people are great at it. Some people really thrive in that area. And I think that's why it's beneficial to learn about what your conflict management style may be. So we can see here on this little table I have, you can find this if you just looked up conflict management styles. You'll see something like this table here. I just snagged it from the internet. There are 5 different main styles that people talk about, and we really encourage you to learn more about your conflict management style, as well as those of your team members, to be able to better understand each other and better be able to handle that conflict. So I know I just told you all that I get nervous around conflict a lot. So I tend to be personally more accommodating. So if you look at the table here, accommodating is on the side of you highly prioritize the relationship and you tend to have a lower importance of achieving the goal. So I'll tend to yield to the other party to let them win just because it eases that discomfort to me. And while that might not be the best thing, that's really good for me to know. And it's good for my team members to know, because then they can better support me and say, hey, at least like maybe you need to stand up for yourself here a little bit more, and we can help find a compromise. So I won't go into each one super in depth, but basically the other 4 are competing, collaborating, compromising, and avoiding. So some people who don't like conflict, I used to be like this, just avoid it completely. Just like it means you're not really prioritizing the relationship, you're not really prioritizing achieving the goal, you're just kind of like hands off. I don't want to look at this, don't want to deal with it. And then there's collaborating, where you try and find a way for both parties to win, which is good. And competing is when one party seeks to satisfy their interest, regardless of how it impacts the other person. So that can be really damaging to the relationship. So what we're kind of looking for is that perfect compromise, and it's hard to find. I think that's why it's like smallest and directly in the middle, because compromise can be difficult. But I really encourage you to look into this. There's different tests you can take, and maybe give this as a fun team bonding activity for you and your executive to learn more about your different conflict management styles. If you want to, you can throw in the chat what one you think that you might be. But I'll go ahead and move on in the meantime. So continuing with conflict, we want to focus a little bit on self-governance within your organizations. So what does this mean? So this is kind of how you're all handling those internal conflicts or issues that are going on. So internally, it is really, really crucial that your organization is practicing self-governance and internal accountability. So like I kind of brought up before, a lot of student orgs were coming to us when they were having internal conflicts, which like we said, that is totally okay. We want to be a support and a resource for you. But there's actual research that shows conflicts are better handled by internal teams rather than external individuals or university bodies such as us. I think when there's an internal conflict and we immediately get brought in, it can breed a lot of distrust among your members, and you know your members better than we do. So if we can find a way to support you in handling that conflict internally, I think that would be the best option. We also found that we didn't find this, this isn't my research, but organizations who self-report policy violations helped promote transparency and trust in their organization and with the university. So being able to self-report and kind of say, hey, I messed up, I did this, and find that accountability actually created better trust in the organization. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about informal sort of accountability processes. So what this means is, I know a lot of you have different maybe boards or ways that you handle when there's a conflict or someone has broken one of your rules and your bylaws. So since I specifically work with the fraternities and sororities, what I see a lot is they'll have a structure where they have a judicial board or some sort of board that handles when a member has broken some sort of bylaw or rule. And what it is that member will come in and face a board, and it is just very formal, and it can create a lot of further conflict. And I know I would be nervous. I've had to get brought in for stuff like that before when I was in my undergrad, and it really stressed me out, especially if you don't like conflict. And so this research has actually shown that having an informal conflict or conduct management approach with your members fostered belonging and well-being. So what they did instead is, if Meredith is in my organization and she messes up, maybe she damages some property at one of our events, instead of bringing her in to face 4 or 5 of us on the board, maybe I just go and have a one-on-one conversation with her. We go for a walk. Or maybe I'm not super close with Meredith in the organization. So instead, I'll ask her best friend that I know is in the org, say, hey, maybe check in with Meredith, see how she's doing. So we can still find ways to hold her accountable and have that conversation, but in a way that is help fostering belonging and well-being. And we all know that belonging is the big thing everyone's talking about on campus right now. We want our members to feel like they belong in order for them to stay in our organization. Okay,
my bad, Elise.
And no, it's okay, I forgive you. You have to approach it with empathy, right? Speaking of empathy, so talking more about this accountability, like we just talked about with Meredith, we want to approach these issues with empathy and concern rather than a punitive, I guess, approach. So, like a punishment. We want to approach accountability with this empathy and the concern for the individual. So I want to highlight concern for the individual rather than concern for the organization. So we want to encourage this individual to maybe self-reflect and find that personal responsibility rather than focusing on the concern for the chapter or the organization. So what this means is we want to avoid threats. So instead of saying like to Meredith, you represent alpha, 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 so you need to do better. Like every day you're wearing alpha, alpha, alpha on your jacket. So you need to represent us. That's very threatening, and that probably doesn't make Meredith want to change her behavior. So instead, we want to say, we want to encourage you to represent and reflect yourself first. So instead, I might say, Meredith, I care about you, and we want to encourage you to represent and represent yourself. Because if Meredith is representing herself, then she will therefore be representing those positive values of our organization. This can create a more positive response. So this approach really fosters that accountability and belonging again, and it's more effective than threatening your members with statements like, you're always representing alpha, alpha, alpha. Okay, so that was mostly the last bit of my spiel. If you have any questions or comments about conflict management, that was just a very touch the surface basis. We can also do different things. If you ever have concerns, we can practice difficult conversations. If you ever want to come in and create a plan, if you're having a conflict with a member, you can always come in and talk to them. I have a little cubicle in the office if you ever want to come talk. But as far as our office, some tips and strategies in general, we want to talk about for developing these effective conflict resolution skills include, like we talked about, empathy, also being an active listener, really making your member feel heard, creating that open communication. I know that can be difficult, especially if you're nervous approaching, but maybe just tell them you're nervous. I found that if I've said, hey, I'm not very good at conflict, I'm a little nervous right now, it kind of creates that vulnerability and breaks down that boundary that'll make it easier for you both to talk about it. And then we have some different problem solving techniques we can work through. So again, our office is a great resource, but primarily we want it to be that last line of defense so that we're encouraging you all to have that internal conflict management. So advisors are a great first point of contact for you all, your faculty advisor, or if you have a specific chapter advisor, maybe talk to them if you're struggling with conflict or professionalism. Of course, if someone is in direct danger or the conflict is life-threatening, please call 911. You can also report the incident on this link right here. It goes straight to our Dean of Students and SS&R team. And then, yeah, again, if it escalates and you feel like you need support from one of us, please reach out, but we will probably find ways for you to handle it internally to help foster that belonging and sense of community in your orgs. And that is all I have.
All right, Elise, we have a question in the chat for you.
Okay.
And we can also open it up to the whole leadership team, everyone here representing LNE, if this helps. How should student organizations and officers handle pushback from other leadership when struggling / being vulnerable?
So it sounds like maybe the other members of the leadership team are struggling to open up and be vulnerable. Is that what I'm taking from it?
Right. Or there's
So,
social enforcement pushing that back.
okay. I guess I would ask first, if you and that officer or those officers have a good foundation. Are you all close? Have you had that bonding experience? Have you been able to have a space where you can have these difficult conversations? Because for a lot of people, it's hard to do right off the bat. You kind of have to build that trust with them first. So one thing we would do with my executive team when I was an undergrad, first thing you do, it's not straight to business. It's let's get to know each other. Let's figure out each other's work love languages or each other's conflict management style, and let's go out to dinner. Let's go on a retreat. Let's do whatever is inclusive or available for our organization to get to know each other first. And then I think once you have that foundation, it'll probably be easier for you to be vulnerable. I also really, really recommend Brene Brown. I know it's kind of a lot of people are Brene Brown fans these days, but she has great talks on vulnerability. And I can go ahead and kind of search for those and put them in the chat. And that might be something beneficial for you and your team to watch or to share with each other. I don't know if that specifically addresses the concern or question. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to touch on as well.
I guess I was just wanting to clarify by pushing back vulnerability, like what is it specifically that you mean by that, or that is meant by pushing back? Like, is it just wanting to basically to express feelings about feeling vulnerable within the club? Or I guess I was just wanting to clarify what it is that you guys mean by pushing back.
So I guess I didn't mean to push back like against being vulnerable. I meant to kind of embrace being vulnerable. It's okay to be professional and still bring in a certain amount of emotion and vulnerability. And I think having vulnerability with your team members helps create belonging and a sense of community in your organization that will overall lead to higher retention rates. So I might have, I don't know if I accidentally said push back on vulnerability. That's not what I meant.
No,
It
that's
was part
the,
of the question.
yeah.
So I think
Okay.
if understanding the question is basically how does that individual handle when they get pushback from their other leaders when struggling with being vulnerable? So it was part of the question itself, unless Paige, if you feel like we didn't address it and you want to clarify.
And then I put the YouTube video, by the way. So I think, starting the conversation with your leadership team and your clubs in general is going to be your best tool. So you might want to play the video we played and talk about it and see, you know, I'd love to be more honest with y'all when I need help, and this is how I can communicate that, and how can I help y'all better? That might help. Additionally, just doing like fun leadership activities where you're building bonds with people and building trust is another way to slowly work at that, which is maybe a little less direct. We have another question from Ava. How much is too much when it comes to vulnerability? And that's a really good question, because part of professionalism is always going to be a slight separation from like the personal and from the self, right? So like, you don't need to trust your officers, your coworkers, your bosses the same degree you trust your significant others, your family, and your friends. And it sometimes comes to a matter of like, how much needs to be shared. If y'all are working on a collaborative goal and there is something personal going on that's more family related, what have you, and it's impacting your ability to meet deadlines, it's to some degree, you might just be able to be a little surface level. But if you see that maybe you can get more support from the people around you, then you can go into a little bit more details that you feel comfortable with. But I think it's important. And also, as a student officer, we also understand that you're holding multiple roles at once. Oftentimes, your fellow officers can also be your friends. And so that can be a harder place to distinguish of how much is too much, if that makes sense.
And if I
Definitely.
can add one thing that happens often, because I work with a lot of like first generation students, is a lot of times that they don't know that the other students that they're in the clubs with are dealing with the exact same struggles. They're dealing with the exact same imposter syndrome feelings or things like that. And I tell them, have you maybe talked to one other person in your org? Because they might feel exactly the way that you do. So no, you don't have to tell everyone everything and be vulnerable with everyone, but there might be some just like camaraderie in the fact that just being open about little pieces of your struggle, that you start to see that other people are hiding that exact same struggle. So don't be afraid to be vulnerable, but again, it's okay to protect what you need to protect.
Definitely. I think it's very personal too, like person by person case, and that's your personal boundaries a lot. So, one thing we talk about on our leadership engagement team recently has been having a boundary setting session, like maybe figure out what people's boundaries are for when to contact. If you're having a bad day, how do you respond? How much personal stuff do we want to include? For me, I'm a very personal person. Like, you can ask me about anything and it'll make me trust you more and feel closer to you, but that's just my personal. So maybe an activity you could do with your officers is kind of a boundary setting and just getting to know how you all respond and react to different scenarios and things like that. But great questions. Thank you all.
And then Alan is clarifying that it's essentially a matter of knowing how to better communicate and work with our colleagues, especially in conflict. And that is essentially what we're trying to get at. And even beyond colleagues, like with other departments and people that are above you and things like that. We know that, anytime you're doing work, even if that's volunteer work or paid work or what have you, there can be times that it's really frustrating, that you feel like you're communicating well and you're still not getting what you need to get done or things like that. And so that's why it's really important that we could still be honest and also not you know, harm other people, get in the way of us achieving our goals, right? Because if we decide to lash out at one staff member in any type of office, it's likely that all of the other staff is going to know as well. Like, we talk to each other, we communicate to each other, and then your club may decrease your opportunities and abilities because of just how one conflict was managed. And so this is why we want to talk about it and let you know that we are on your side. We're trying to support you to make sure that you're developing these professional and communication skills more broadly. Do we have any more questions about this section? And it's okay. Everybody goes through ups and downs with communication. I've had some terrible fights. I just try to, you know, I work on it and I try to get better, especially in professional settings. Are there any trainings that anyone in the Office of Leadership and Engagement would recommend on this type of thing?
Does Amanda have, LME team, correct me if I'm wrong, does Amanda have some sort of training for this? I think it's like approaching difficult situations. Something like that. I can double check on it, but I think I've taken it with Kaden.
I don't remember. I know of two options. One of them is Udemy. Any NEU student has access to Udemy, which are online modules, and a lot of content there about leadership, conflict resolution. There's so many great modules that you could do at your own pace. And I usually take those as fun, you could say. Yeah, I don't have a life, sorry. But I take those courses as fun to learn a little more on how to address those concerns or like learn more about those topics. And hopefully within the next couple of months or semester, we'll try to create workshops of leadership and implement those type of topics like conflict resolution or anything like that. So more to come on that for this upcoming academic year. That's our hope.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the past too, I worked with a chapter last year that was struggling with some conflict management, and they approached me and we kind of made a individualized plan. So if you're ever like struggling with something specific, you can come to one of us and we might be able to work on something like that with you. I don't want to promise or put anything else on anyone else's plates, but like for the FSL chapters I work with, that's always an option.